Thank you for that welcome, and thank you to all the members of the organizing committee for their efforts, and thanks to the College of DuPage for having me come. We're just up the road, so when you finish here, you can go there and finish your BAs or go for a master's degree. And we have scholarship funding for Southeast Asian Studies. You can major in any major and do a minor or a graduate concentration in Southeast Asian Studies and get scholarships to pay for your education. So I had to I have to start with a plug. No problem with. The introduction there stole a bit of my thunder, but I'll start with where is Southeast Asia. So south of, is there a pointer? Oop. Oh no. There we go. Okay, so south of China and east of India. Here's India. There are 11 countries of Southeast Asia. So Burma, also now called Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and then right here at the tip of Malaysia is Singapore. Right here on the island part of Malaysia is Brunei. And then out here, one of the newest countries in the world is East Timor. So 11 countries of the region. So today I'm going to talk about Southeast Asia as a crossroads, and to focus on the dynamic nature of the region. That is, that across time there have been these cultural flows, which gives this region great diversity. Movements of people across the region, movements of trade across the region, but with those movements of people come new ideas, new religions, new political systems, and then therefore there's great diversity. So there are 1,000 languages, more than 1,000 languages, hundreds of different ethnic groups. We'll talk a bit about the main religious differences across the region. And then the fact that it's long been a center of trade networks and trade networks between India and China, but then also from those two places outward. So from India on to Europe, and then once sailing technologies got better and we started to cross oceans, across to the New World as well. So here's that map again, but with some of those trade routes on them. So when human beings first came out of Africa, or actually the ancestors of modern humans first came out of Africa, they turned right. So coming up this way, down through India, and on down into Southeast Asia. Later, they came out and also turned left and went up into Europe, but that was still pretty cold at the time. So when ancestors of humans first came out, they went this way. And we know that because all the way down here in Java, we have the remains of Java man, which were redated in the last 10 years to 1.8 million years ago. So that's very, very early to have gotten that far. We have a slightly later Peking man up here in northern China, but we know that they walked out here. So how did they walk out to the islands? Well, in that time period when the Earth was colder, all of this area was land. It's called the Sunda Shelf. So you could, at that time, walk out to the islands of what's now Indonesia. You couldn't get all the way to the Philippines, you couldn't get all the way to Australia, but you could get down into what's now the islands of Indonesia. So human beings have been in this area for a very, very long time. Then, as humans started to build boats and get better at movement, what they did was they sailed along the edges of the land. So we know that there was very early trade between India and Southeast Asia, and the boats would go across from India, they'd hit the coast of Myanmar, hit the coast of Thailand. There are sites here, very early archaeological sites from before the turn of the millennium on the west coast of Malaysia. Then they go through the Straits of Malacca, around the corner, up here to a site at the tip of what is now southern Vietnam, and then again to central Vietnam, and then on to China. Once the sailing technologies improved and people dared to go away where they couldn't see land, and they began to harness the winds, the great sailing ships, people began to use the monsoon winds. So as this map shows, half the year the monsoon winds blow this way, and half the year they blow the other way. So the sailing ships would sail from India across to Southeast Asia with the monsoon winds, and then stay. People would stay and there were trading entrepôts that developed in the region, and then when the wind shifted, they would use the winds to sail back. So Southeast Asia develops as this crucial trading, these sort of nodes on crucial trading networks between India and China, in part so that people could use those winds. So prehistoric populations, if you go way back, as I said, all the way back to 1.8 million years ago, we know that there were small hunting and gathering populations that moved across this region, exploiting resources. We've found some very early sites, although a lot of the sites are presumably lost because they would have been out there on the Sunda Shelf. They would have been in the river valleys, which are now underwater. And then there's the development of early city-states at around 2,000 years ago. And I'm going to talk about one of those right at the tip of southern Vietnam in a moment. And because of this strategic position between India and China, Southeast Asia was long thought of as a sort of backwater where things just flowed in. Things flowed in from India, things flowed in from China, and they just absorbed. Now, over time, archaeologists have discovered that, in fact, those exchanges were multi-directional, and some things may have developed in Southeast Asia and flowed outward to those other areas. So, rice cultivation, for example, the Chinese claim to have invented irrigated rice cultivation, and indeed they may have, but we have rice cultivation at very early archaeological sites in Southeast Asia. So it may have also flowed the other way. But two crucial things that probably did flow in from outside, from China or from India, probably from India, water lifting devices. So there's many different kinds. Now they're all being replaced by mechanized pumps. But when I first started going to Southeast Asia about 25 years ago, many of these traditional methods were still being used. So there's one that's kind of got a scoop, and you get a swinging motion going. You dip into the water in the canal, and then you throw, and it throws water out into the field. There's kinds that multiple people use where they hold onto ropes and it dips into the water and then you flick it and it throws water out into the field. So there's one that you ride like a bicycle and it turns a wheel that lifts water on small cups and sort of throws it out into the field. Those water lifting devices were developed very early in India and probably came to the region. And then the iron-tipped or metal-tipped plow probably came into the region from China at around 200 AD. There's a leap in agricultural technologies at around that time. So from China, we know there were these technologies. From India, we have very dramatic evidence of the influence, that conversion to Hinduism and Buddhism in the early 2nd to 6th century AD, and we know that both religions were present because we found inscriptions, because we found Buddhist images and Hindu images, temple architecture, and around the same time, Southeast Asian countries developed written scripts, and those scripts are based on South Indian written scripts. So here's an example. Let me go one more. I said before, right here at the tip of what's now Vietnam is one of those places that developed a trading entrepot. So I worked down here for 3 summers with a group of archaeologists. I'm not an archaeologist, but I had great fun for 3 summers. I'm a cultural anthropologist, so I was interviewing people. but I hung out with the archaeologists while they were digging. So there's down here, this is the coast, and a French archaeologist named Malloret had found a site, excavated this site in the 1920s. And it was a large city occupied from around the 1st century AD until about the 5th century AD. And it was a trading city. And we know this because of the materials that Malloret found. So he found Roman coins and other artifacts that show that they were trading all the way to the Mediterranean on one side. They found these statues and other religious artifacts to show that both Hinduism and Buddhism had come into the area. And they found Chinese porcelains. So they know that the trade was going up to China the other way. So where I worked was up here in Angkor Borei. This is the speculated course of an ancient canal that ran between the two. And up here at Angkor Borei, what I was working on with a geographer was about agricultural systems. And this is a particularly rich agricultural zone. Just south of the city, where it's in the floodplain, you can grow dry season rice. And just north of this city, that's a little bit higher elevation, you grow wet season rice. And so this was probably the breadbasket for this trading entrepot. And they took the rice down the canal to feed all those traders who would have been stuck there between the monsoons. So, and I took this little picture because it's a dramatic example of Indian influence. It's a small little temple at Angkor Borei. It sits up on a hillside, the Ashram Maharaji, but it is completely Indian in form, as though it was taken apart stone by stone and then put back together like a jigsaw puzzle on this mountain in Cambodia. It dates to about the 5th century AD. So later temples in the region developed these Cambodian characteristics, and you can see the transformation as the local indigenous influences changed the art and architecture that they were receiving. But this is a perfect example of a sort of pure Indian influence in the region. So it's just an example of one site where you can see this commingling of cultural influences. So again, that's right here. So that was in the time period where you'd come around the corner, sort of hit here, and then go on up to China. After these trading cities and these cultural influences from India, large Hindu kingdoms develop across the region. So this is one of the most dramatic examples, is the Angkor Wat. So the Angkorian Empire, which was Cambodian, spread out, built a network of these city-states, sort of absorbed these other city-states in the region, and got large enough that they built large-scale stone monuments. So Angkor Wat is the largest religious building in the world. It's a little bigger than the Vatican. It is carved. All the surface of that is carved. It is dedicated to the god Vishnu. But each of the Cambodian kings during this era built their own monuments. So this whole region is dotted with stone monuments that go across about a 500-year period, about 800 AD until 1400s. So this is sort of the age of Hindu kingdoms across the region. One of the key features of Southeast Asia is this complex relationship between upland and lowland peoples. So the dominant ethnic groups go down onto the plains and develop these large city-states that are focused on wet rice agriculture. So Burmans in Burma, Thais are a bit later, and Cambodians, the Vietnamese in the Red River Delta, Indonesians out on the island of Java. Both Hinduism and Buddhism, but the Buddhism tends to be a bit later. And then in the uplands, there are Swidden agriculturalists, people who are doing what's often called slash and burn agriculture, or small-scale gardening societies. that's where you get part of this diversity in language and culture is across all the different islands of Indonesia. There are many different ethnic groups, and then along the edges are certain people, and then as you go up the mountains, you get, again, different ethnic groups as you go. Across time, the great world religions come. So in the 13th century, Islam moves along those trade routes and comes into the area with traders. Malaysia, Indonesia, the southern Philippines, and part of what is now southern Thailand convert to Islam in this time period. And then from the 12th to the 4th century, a particular form of Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, comes to dominate in Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and southern Vietnam, a form of Mahayana Buddhism in the rest of Vietnam. And then with Westerners in the 15th and 16th century, Christianity, especially Catholicism, comes with the Spanish into the Philippines and northern Vietnam. So 15th and 16th century, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Spanish come into the region. And what are they looking for? Or where was Columbus going anyway? So his attempt when he tried to sail around the world was to get to the East Indies, and particularly to get to the source of spices. So we take these completely for granted today when we put black pepper on our eggs in the morning, or when we put cinnamon in cookies, or nutmegs, or cloves, or, but when these were first discovered and moving along these trade routes, the demand for these just exploded in Europe. And these spices were quite literally worth a fortune. So to get a ship from the islands where those were found to Batavia, which was the Dutch trading entrepot, and then all the way across to India, around to Cape Town, and up to Amsterdam. A ship, a galleon, a wooden sailing ship, loaded with black pepper, was literally worth its weight in gold. So you could make a fortune. You could become rich by just getting one shipload of spices back to Europe. Try to imagine all of our food without any spices. You know, that's what European food tasted like before this trade. So along these routes too, still moved the things that had moved since very early times. So porcelain, tea, sugar, silk, precious metals from China, cloth, silver from India. The peninsula here, the mainland of Southeast Asia, in early Indian text is called Savanapum, which is the area of gold. So there was gold in Southeast Asia. That was another thing that was exported. Also tin. There's a lot of tin in Malaysia. Rubber. So these trade routes, which used to be local regional trade routes, expand into these worldwide trade routes. The Spanish then added the New World. So Spanish galleons would sail from Spain to Mexico and load up with silver. Then they'd sail from Mexico across to the Philippines and load up with goods from Southeast Asia and then return. So colonialism across the region, the British in Burma and Malaysia, the French in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Spanish in the Philippines, the Dutch in Indonesia, and then of course us, the Americans, we take over the Philippines as a colony after the Spanish-American War. So only Thailand remains independent across this time period. And the current political regimes, democratic or semi-democratic, at least they have elections, in Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, and East Timor. Vietnam and Laos are still a couple of the few remaining countries in the world who are communist. And then authoritarian regimes, I put Burma, or the new name Myanmar, although one has to ask about the current regimes in Cambodia and Thailand as well, whether or not they're democratic or not. Thailand had a military coup d'etat about a year ago and is under a military government. And Cambodia, the last issue of The Economist called it a thugocracy. I think the current government, whether or not the elections that are allowed there are free and fair, is an open question. And then Brunei is an Islamic sultanate. So the Sultan of Brunei is one of the richest people in the world. So another product of the region is oil. Brunei has oil, Indonesia has oil, East Timor has oil. So why is it that we should pay attention to this region today? Why is it important to us as Americans? Well, here's some of the reasons. They have over 600 million people. While the US economy slowed after the crash in 2008, Asian economies continued to grow, about 5% a year across the region. Major trading partners with the United States, $1.2 trillion in trade last year. That it's a source of oil, rice, rubber, tin, gold, and textiles. If you look in the shirt that you bought recently at Old Navy or The Gap, you might very well find a tag that says made in Cambodia or made in Indonesia or made in Vietnam. And this, the idea of factory Asia. I was reading this really interesting article in The Economist about where industrial production is taking place in the world. And of course, a large portion of it has been happening in China where labor is so inexpensive. But what's happening is that labor costs are increasing in China. And in reaction, what Chinese companies are doing is they're outsourcing the work to Southeast Asia. So Chinese-owned companies are setting up subsidiaries in Vietnam, in Burma, where so a good example is textiles. Cambodia went from having about 1,000 textile workers to having about 300,000 textile workers, almost all young women working in these factories, and then those are transshipped either directly to the United States or to China and then outward from China. So 46% of the world's goods now are produced between China and then Southeast Asia. And then an important tourist destination. So American tourists like to go to the region, to Thailand, to see Angkor Wat in Cambodia, to go to see other sites in the region. And this is another phenomenon, is that as China is getting increasingly wealthy, they're also joining those world tourist flows. So even though there are many poor people in China, there are now also many rich people in China or middle-class people in China who can afford the plane tickets to travel. And this is a very popular region for destination. So an example of this dynamic trade, Singapore is still at this crossroads. Singapore is the world's busiest seaport. It handles goods for 20 of the top 25 logistics companies in the world. Not only the seaport, but the airport. 6,100 flights to 210 cities, carrying 2 million tons of cargo annually. So it's the cargo side of its airport is one of the busiest in the world. So it's still that crucial location. So here's Singapore. So oil flowing from the Middle East, moving along sea lanes, go through the Straits of Malacca, and then up to China, to Korea, to Japan, to those other industrialized countries of Asia. And similarly, all those goods that are being produced in China and the region are going out this way through the canal up to Europe or off transshipped out through Singapore and then off to the rest of the world. So other pressing issues at the moment. You may know that President Obama announced this pivot. So we're going to, besides focusing all of our foreign policy energy on the Middle East, we're also now going to pivot and pay more attention to Asia, to China, and to Southeast Asia. And as part of this change in U.S. policy, some of the issues that are being addressed include conflict with China over the islands in the South China Sea. So these islands, some of which have oil, oil explorations being done in this region, but this red dotted line shows you China's claim. So essentially China claims everything to within a couple of miles of the shore in some places. The blue lines show you, if it was a regular 200-mile limit, where the lines would be. So these islands would probably belong to the Philippines, or these islands along the coast would belong to Vietnam. Malaysia claims some, but the Chinese have begun building outposts, building landing strips, building ports on these islands, and is claiming all of them. There's rising tension between China and the ASEAN countries over trade issues as well as over these islands. And the U.S. is worried. U.S. worries about this expanding influence of China is part of what made us do that shift in policy. So a couple of years ago, President Obama made a historic trip to visit Burma. We dropped, as the Burmese government shifted some of its policies, we dropped part of the trade sanctions, most of the trade sanctions, and have begun to have relations with the government there. So we're very concerned to sort of counterbalance. We want to have American influence in the countries of the region to counterbalance this rising influence from China. Another important topic that requires attention is the vulnerability of this region to climate change. So as we begin to think worldwide, what would happen if the water rose a meter everywhere in the world? There was a National Geographic, the last issue of National Geographic has a really wonderful map of Florida. What would Florida look like if water really went up 1 meter? So the Florida Keys and all of the southern tip of Florida disappear. So in Southeast Asia, many of the countries are, the huge population centers are right at sea level. In that area right at the tip of Vietnam, for example, there's 60 million people in Vietnam. If that entire delta was suddenly underwater, where would those people go? The other areas, it's marked as highly endangered in part because of those large population areas are right on the coast, but also because there's deforestation, overlogging in the uplands in Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and many countries of the mainland. And another concern to us is religious conflict around the region. There is a conflict between the Catholic North and the Muslim South in the Philippines, between Buddhists in the North and Muslims in the South in Thailand. In Myanmar, there are both religious conflicts between Buddhists and Muslims in the Rakhine states or Arakan, and also between the central government and minorities. So there's been some discussion about these local conflicts being linked to larger international jihad movements to Al-Qaeda or now to ISIS, and indeed small numbers of people have gone from this region to join ISIS. But at the same time, they are primarily local problems. There have been more people go from France than go from Indonesia to join ISIS. So by and large, these are the Muslim population in this region are moderate Muslims, and the issues are local. I mean, the issues in the Philippines, for example, while the division is between Catholics and Muslims, many of the issues at stake are economic. That is, migrants from the Christian North coming into the areas of the southern Philippines and taking land. And just as the Irish conflict is partly about Protestant and Catholic, but also about who controls the resources. So another reason that we should pay attention is the influences from the region on the United States in terms of movements of people. So there's been, in part because the Philippines was our colony, there's been large-scale migration from the Philippines to the United States for a very long period of time. Filipinos came to the U.S. to cut sugarcane in the sugarcane fields in Hawaii in the early part of the 20th century, and continue to come to this day. Now many as skilled labor in the medical fields. Migration in the 70s and 80s from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos as war refugees, refugees now from Burma, so that this population here in Illinois, there's probably about 5,000 Cambodians. There's large Lao communities in Elgin and in Rockford. There's about over 1 million Vietnamese now in the United States. And the influences from these different cultures in the United States is evident. I mean, if you can buy lemongrass and kaffir lime leaves now in Jewel. I mean, the influence on cooking, on music, on the arts is evident in our society. So the last thing I would mention is that these various countries of Southeast Asia are joining together, and that the ASEAN Economic Community, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is set to become more integrated now with a new agreement that goes into effect in 2015, so that they'll become more like the European Union. Not a common currency, but it'll be easier for goods and people to move across the region. That's it. So I'm happy to take your questions.